In December 2015, world leaders came together to sign the Paris Agreement, committing our planet to a course to keep our global temperatures below a 2 degrees rise in temperature. We have an urgent need to decarbonize our planet and our industries to keep these temperatures lower than 2 degrees. The real estate sector, buildings, we are responsible for more than 35% of all energy consumption and CO2 emissions, and we therefore feel a real need and a responsibility to act. And Redevco wants to take leadership on this issue. We want to demonstrate that we also are doing our bit and contributing to this fight against the climate crisis. As a result, last year, end of 2019, we made a commitment to work towards a net zero carbon portfolio by 2040. And we've called this our Mission 2040. In essence, what it means is that we follow the World Green Building Council's definition for advancing net zero in the built environment, which means that we want to measure and disclose the energy consumption and the carbon emissions of our assets under management. We want to work hard on improving the energy efficiency of all of our buildings together with our tenants to, in that sense, reduce the energy consumed in our buildings. We also want to ensure that as much as possible, any energy consumption is being generated by renewable sources, such as solar panels on the roofs of our buildings. And lastly, we also want to tackle as much as possible and make conscious choices around embodied carbon and looking at the whole life cycle of our assets. We know that we can't do this alone. We need to do this in partnership with our tenants, with all sorts of suppliers and advisors on the building front. But we are committed to working towards this journey because it is so important for the future of our planet. And whilst our own portfolio is, of course, but a tiny drop in the ocean, if we can all get on this journey and contribute just a little bit, it will make a difference.
Thanks very much, Clemens. Really interesting. I think that that focus on carbon neutrality, reaching that. Super panel here. So we have Julie Irigoyen, who's Chief Executive of the UK Green Building Council, and we've got Colin Marr, who's CEO of Fabric, and of course we have Clemens. You didn't mention it, Clemens, in that introductory address, but just briefly, just tell us a little bit more about yourself and Redevco.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So Redevco is a real estate investment management organization. We look after the interests of multiple investor clients, and we have a portfolio of assets spread across Europe, primarily in retail real estate, but also diversifying into residential, urban logistics, and other kind of mixed-use urban real estate. My role is head of sustainability, and with that, really helping to drive our sustainability and ESG ambitions through all of our business processes across the different European jurisdictions where we're active.
Great, thanks very much. Julie.
So my name's Julie Irigoyen. As you said, I'm the Chief Executive at UK Green Building Council. We are a charity and an industry network. We have over 450 members here in the UK that span the whole of that property and construction value chain. So everything from institutional investors, REITs, property companies, construction companies, architects, engineers, product manufacturers, and so on. And our mission is to radically improve the sustainability of the built environment across all stages of its life cycle, all different asset types, suitably ambitious. Everything we do is by our members, for our members, but we do also influence and try to advocate for higher standards through government policy, both central government and local government.
Great, thanks very much. Colin.
I'm Colin Marr, CEO of Fabric. We are a software and data company that offers a platform designed for those who monitor or want to improve the sustainable performance of buildings. It's an exciting time for us with the net zero carbon movement and discussions on building and operating buildings in more efficient and sustainable ways continue to gain momentum. We work very closely with partners and organizations who are also committed to the movement, like Redevco and the UK GBC. And we hope to contribute to the movement by making data-driven insights and tools available to the community.
And it's been interesting. So during a number of the discussions, ESG sustainability has come up, and I think there's a lot of interest in terms of how you do that, and also some of the practical steps that you need to take in order to make either an asset or a portfolio carbon neutral. And so it's going to be really interesting to get your views on that. I mean, Clemens, you highlighted Mission 2040 and the commitment to make the entire portfolio net zero carbon. And as part of that, collaboration seemed to be a key aspect. I mean, it's interesting that we've got collaboration partners here on the panel, but why do you see that as such an important element, I guess, for you?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the fact that, the humble realization that we can't do this by ourselves. Obviously, we are asset manager, asset owner, and there's a whole lot that we can influence and decide on unilaterally in terms of the buildings themselves, the building fabric, the materials, how we want them to be built when we are optimizing them, redeveloping them. But ultimately, we have occupiers, we have tenants, and it's the tenants' own behavior that also influences energy consumption. It's especially in the retail real estate world, tenants are largely responsible for their own installations. So we really have to and want to seek out that collaboration with them to help make smart choices around how our buildings are being occupied, so that we can help to drive the energy consumption down, the CO2 footprint down, and contribute to our net zero carbon 2040 target. And in the end, hopefully our partners realize that this is a joint effort that they also can and should be contributing to.
And that's interesting. And Julia, I wanted to pick up with you. I mean, UK Green Building Council, I mean, obviously, you mentioned there that, you're leading the industry transition to net carbon, zero net carbon. And I was researching this a little bit and noted that you'd launched the Advancing Net Zero program in 2018, and various other initiatives since then. But maybe just highlight for us some of the key aspects of those programs for people who don't know that, because I think it would be interesting for them to see, what that program involves.
Sure, more than happy to do that. And Clemens already mentioned the World Green Building Council net zero carbon sort of framework, if you like, which is one which we and all the other 75 other GBCs globally are sort of trying to align with, and doing particular work within our own countries that is really necessary to get the industry and government to align on what that means. So for us in UK, one of the early milestones was convening an industry consensus really around what should the definition of net zero carbon buildings in the UK specifically mean. And we came out with that framework definition in April 2019, really defining what net zero carbon in new construction, net zero carbon for existing assets in operation should mean. And then, of course, most importantly, with more work to be done around it, net zero carbon whole life for assets, property assets throughout their entire life cycle. Since then, we've done more work to, I guess, add depth and detail to the guidance around what some of that means. And to give you a good example of that, what's really important with definitions of net zero carbon buildings is that there is a minimum standard of energy efficiency that's achieved. So we can't just put a building up and then offset all of the emissions associated with its use of energy or its embodied carbon. We need to achieve minimum standards of efficiency, minimum standards of embodied carbon, and so on. So we worked quite early on with a number of other partners to come up with some minimum energy performance standards for offices. And you would, as one would expect, those tighten over time. So in a sort of 5-year ratcheting up level of ambition, they get more and more stringent. Most recently, just last week, we launched a cost evaluation study that looked at both an office tower block and a residential tower block, and tracked the design and construction alterations that would need to be done on those baseline designs for today's design specs. to achieve those 2025 and 2030 net zero carbon standards. And we looked at the cost implications of that as well. And I'm pleased to say that the cost implications of achieving those 2025 standards were really quite marginal when one considers that against the sort of increased value potential of those types of assets and of that level of performance. It was about 3.5% for the residential and 6% for the office to achieve that 2025 standard. So those are the sorts of things that we're really trying to work with our members on, really trying to get very practical about what does this mean, what are the solutions, how much does it cost, where is the value.
And that's interesting. And obviously, one of the key areas for that, if you're tracking those things, is measurability. And Colin, obviously, that's where you come into the picture, in essence. I mean, it seems measurability obviously seems key for any company seeking to achieve net zero. But I guess, you know, you've seen the challenges that companies have with this. So I guess, what are the challenges and how have you sought to solve those?
Right. Yeah, the ability to measure performance effectively is certainly key for any organization that wants to achieve net zero carbon objectives. And there's a core requirement for operating management systems to continuously track and improve performance over time. And this is also important for disclosure and compliance purposes. I think transparency is also going to be very key for this movement going forward. And to these ends, organizations, of course, must have reliable and complete data sets to work with, and also means to put that data to use to get value out of the data and to action on some of these insights. But this is often easier said than done, of course. So if you have a portfolio of buildings, for example, you're likely to have data that have to be collected from multiple sources, for example, and the data might come in different formats or quality. So effective data management practices are key, and this is something that we want to help with technology, whereby the data collection process can be automated and be as structured as possible so that users can have access to data they can trust. And I think once you do have that solid data set in hand, then you really want to, again, get value out of the data as well and really put it to good use. And in some cases, this can be a challenge as well. You know, oftentimes data are stored in spreadsheets or found offline somewhere, or they're in systems that maybe only certain types of users can access. And again, we see technology as a solution and want to make sure that access to data within the context of managing the sustainable performance of buildings can be made really available. And that's access to not only technical users, but also non-technical ones, so that insights can be uncovered in a more collaborative basis, and that results can be shared and socialized as well.
And that's, I mean, that's an interesting point. And I mean, just thinking about the challenges side of it, Clemens, I mean, any portfolio, and obviously we can drill down a little bit more into the Redevco one, but any portfolio obviously has a series of different types of buildings, some older, some newer, and I'm guessing, what are some of the challenges that you face as a business to reach net zero by 2040, which is 10 years earlier than the 2050 target that's been set? And I suppose, you know, have you got plans in place for all of these, or are some of these that you're hoping to have a plan for this part of it by 2030, or how have you structured that?
No, thanks for the question, because it does really come down to sort of your implementation plan of your roadmap to net zero carbon. And, you know, let's start by saying that also for us, you know, it's a little bit a leap of faith in the sense that we did a lot of analysis to understand where we are today, and we're still fine-tuning that. But we're also confident that through the types of things that we do, the interventions that we do on our assets on an ongoing basis anyway, will allow us to get a long way in that direction. And let me just briefly outline what I mean by that. As Colin was saying, it starts with data. We've been trying to collect tenant energy data in our retail portfolio already for 8 or 9 years. This is a hugely sort of manual exercise, and spreadsheets galore that don't really allow us to have proper insight into really where we stand. Hence our choice to now collaborate closely with Fabric to get that set up and running so that we can actually do something with the insights that come out of it at an asset level, that we can feed that back to tenants so that tenants also can make their own choices on commissioning or adjusting technical installations to again improve efficiency and save cost. There's a real benefit for them there. And in the end, it's also for us to just be able to report and show the progress that we're making, because we know that we have to get from around 200,000 tons of CO2 from our portfolio today down to basically zero in 20 years' time. And what does that really mean? That means that with every intervention in the natural life cycle of a building, be it at a vacant unit or a new lease moment, or with major maintenance or the redevelopment that we proactively plan, we can make conscious choices. We can really look at how we want to design things differently, what material choices we use, the engagement with the potential occupiers around the installations that will go into these buildings, and ensure that we're doing things as efficiently as we can with the knowledge and the innovation of today. And obviously, in the coming 20 years, we're hoping that that's going to get better and better. Our estimation is based on sort of the experiences that we've done so far in our portfolio, is that we will probably be able to reduce 30 to 40% of our CO2 footprint across the whole portfolio purely by the redevelopment and improvement initiatives at asset level. And therefore, you still have a massive gap. And that massive gap has to be filled by, on the one hand, greater use of renewable energy. So that's why we're embarking on an investment program to install solar panels on the roofs of many of our assets. And have our tenants use that green energy. A big part of it will be that we need to encourage as many tenants as possible to also buy green energy from the grid. And if our tenants make that conscious choice, or if, for example, in assets where we're responsible for the purchasing of energy, you specifically choose to buy a green contract, that means that there's no CO2 related to that energy consumption, and that helps again. And I think the renewable energy component, based on our current portfolio, could account for, again, a further sort of even up to 40% of the CO2 reduction in our portfolio as it stands today. And then we get left with 20-25% remaining, which is a question around offsetting. And that becomes a choice that we then make at some point down the line towards 2040. But we hope that also technological advancement, and we hope that government intervention on national grids to make them greener, that will all help, so that ultimately by 2040, hopefully, we have a portfolio that is more or less net zero carbon.
Great. And Julie, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion, and we're obviously following the news flow as well, and seeing much more of a focus also from logistics companies, from across the sectors really on this, and a lot of discussion around it, particularly, in the past months during the health crisis, maybe, because of lack of travel and those kinds of things. It seems to have come, much more in general focus as well as in the industry. But are you actually seeing that, I suppose, moving into more action, more people becoming involved, more people beginning to look at taking up these programs?
Absolutely. Just to give you a couple of proxy figures there, from our own perspective, as an organisation, we're a membership organisation. Ultimately, we would be relevant to everyone in this sector. We have since January alone seen over 70 organisations join our network, which is unprecedented in terms of the level of kind of interest and appetite. But in terms of the actual actions being taken, I think, much as I described earlier, we have now achieved clarity finally around what does this mean. And that has taken us some time, but it is an absolutely critical first milestone. And the next question that we get asked all the time is, how do I do it? So we are shifting our focus as an organisation very much into the sort of sourcing and dissemination of the practical solutions that enable us to achieve this, whether that be on an existing building, on a new construction, on a refurbishment or retrofit, and so on. And by that I also mean the sort of the cost and value implications. I think there's a couple of really significant opportunities as well as the challenges, which Clemens very eloquently set out. So just to point to two of those, I guess there's been. I mean, I've been in working in sustainable property for over 20 years, and if I had a pound for every time I've been asked to demonstrate the link between sustainability, performance and value, I'd be very well off. The fact is it's not been that easy to do that, right? It's very difficult to disassociate just the sustainability performance parameters and demonstrate that any value uplift, whether be that capital or rental or any yield compression or what have you, is directly associated with that and only that. So the causal effect is challenging to demonstrate. And as we all know, valuation is a much more subjective art than it is just an algorithm that spits out a number. And just that sense of the investor and occupier sentiment is going to drive up that value uplift much, much faster. So, here in the UK, investors are, the scale of investment into high performing, whether that be BREEAM outstanding or EPC A's and B's, or, one can look at slightly different metrics. Needless to say, the scale of investment into those types of assets that are performing that well has, in offices, it's pretty much doubled year on year, over the past few years. So that gives you a really kind of neat sense of the scale of uptick, and also amongst occupiers, right? Because various surveys into what workers want demonstrate that particularly the sort of younger generations, 20 to 30-year-old workers are complaining about the environmental performance, and you raise the health and well-being aspects, the air quality aspects and so on of the premises that they're expected to work in. So, occupiers are very much seeing their buildings in quite a different light now, and seeing them as a key sort of brand expression of brand values, culture, a means of attracting and retaining talent, and all of this is pushing the actual demand and the sort of the real market drivers that will make that action happen in the right direction. So I think the value piece is really interesting. The only other one the other one I was going to point to is around financing, and we're seeing an enormous interest, a real momentum around the capital providers, the lending community, and banks around buildings in particular as an asset class, not least as they recognise where the risks lie within their portfolios, their lending portfolios and so on, but also as they start to themselves want to take a more proactive and ambitious role in accelerating the transition to net zero. And they recognise that they have a real lever there that they can deploy. So the green revolving loan facilities, green bonds, green loans that are emerging and growing in this sector to enable that action to be implemented are growing exponentially. And I think that both of those things will drive much more mainstream uptick in net zero carbon action rather than just the leaders in the sector.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I want to drill down a little bit more into those kind of practical steps side that you mentioned there, Julie, and also pick up on what Clemens said, just in terms of the challenges around single assets and portfolios. And Colin, so, I mean, looking at a portfolio or an asset, so how does the technology and reporting, actually help people to the next step in terms of monitoring, reporting, driving improvements? Because obviously those kind of practical steps are what people need to be able to drive that performance.
Right. Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, we really see technology and effective ways to measure results and performance as the foundation for continuous improvement. And when looking at a portfolio of assets or even a single asset, I think it's often helpful to have as complete and as granular of a data set as possible. So, for example, you would probably want data that is at least in half-hourly resolution, ideally, so that you can see intraday trends and anomalies that can be proactively analyzed. And I think you also want to monitor performance not only at the asset level, but perhaps by subsites or by building services, so that it would be possible to really drill into specific areas that do offer opportunities to improve performance or to reduce energy demand. And ideally, I think you also want to not only have energy data, I think that's a great starting point, but also data on how buildings are being used by occupiers, for example, weather data, data on how building systems are operating, and other data sets that that when combined with energy use data, you can really have a complete picture on ways to improve the energy performance of a building or a portfolio of buildings. And it's a really exciting time, I think, because more sophisticated technologies for taking measurements for various indicators, like IoT sensors, for example, are becoming more readily available. So for us, again, as a data company, there are a lot of exciting options out there to provide our partners and clients more visibility into ways to optimize a building or a set of buildings. So yes, I think technology that drives effective monitoring and reporting can be a very significant catalyst for uncovering insights and to improve performance.
And just to pick up on that, Colin, I mean, it sounds as though, you know, we're almost moving, and maybe we are, moving into that sort of element of real-time data in order to take the positive action. Does that mean, though, that clients, and by that I mean the occupiers, but also, I guess, everybody involved in that value chain, the investors and the asset managers, all have to agree to that? Or do you sometimes get pushback on that? What's the situation?
Yeah, I think just having structure and really being open about why this data is valuable and how this data would be used, that usually aligns the interests of different stakeholders. And again, just bring structure to a process and really demonstrating that this is an important piece of the puzzle. I think that's usually the best way to get buy-in and alignment.
Okay, good. And Clemens, I think it would be useful for people who are watching, who either may be thinking about going down this route or have maybe started in some form. Just are there examples which you can either show or describe of how you're actually putting this plan into action at the moment in terms of either specific assets or asset types?
Yeah, so I think, you know, Redevco's been on the sort of sustainability journey for many years already, and for the past 10 years we've been using BREEAM as our kind of methodology to rate how our assets are performing and to set targets on improving the BREEAM rating at those natural moments in the life cycle of the asset. We like it because it's a holistic approach, and you get reminded to think about things that is not just energy related. We made a conscious choice to focus on our net zero carbon ambition, just to really help our entire organization rally around being able to have real impact potentially on the planet by drastically reducing the CO2 footprint that is associated with our portfolio. And it basically has just started by looking at some of the redevelopments that we've done in the past and recognizing that just by doing what we do and optimizing these assets, we have already been able to achieve between 35 and 40% energy consumption reduction between a sort of pre-development and a post-development situation. And that's already not bad, but it was not necessarily done with a specific focus on really trying to drive energy efficiency. So I'm convinced, at least, that as we progress, by also setting then our own teams, more explicit targets about energy intensity, for example. If we know that an asset today, based on the data that we'll get out of our Fabric system, that the asset performs at, let's say, 190 kilowatt hours per square meter per year, we can say to the team, okay, post-development, you need to be targeting a minimum energy intensity of, let's say, 100 or 90 or even 80, in line with what Julie was saying earlier. And that's then something that they can then take with them to their architects, to the services engineers, and also to the prospective tenants, and say, guys, this is what we want to achieve. We believe, we are convinced that this is a good thing in helping to make sure that this building is future-proof for the future, and let's work on this together to make this happen. and then ultimately you want to record and measure again after the fact that you are able to hit that target. And the encouraging thing that we have noticed on one or two of our developments in the last few years is that this minimum energy efficiency for retail buildings is, by the Dutch Green Building Council, for example, set at 80 kilowatt hours a square meter. By focusing on a redevelopment and really going the whole way, as it were, we actually got that asset to 88 kilowatt hours a square meter. So very close to sort of that Paris-proof target already today. So it strengthens us to believe that it is possible, but we need more of those kinds of case studies. We need more of those examples to demonstrate, what does that actually look like? What did we do in terms of the design, in terms of the material choice, in terms of installations, to get it to be that efficient? And let's not forget, we still look at BREEAM because it's not just the E side of ESG that is important. We also want to be making sure that we're thinking about S topics as well for our building occupiers and for building visitors, etc.
Great, thank you. I mean, it's interesting that discussion around the sort of measurability bit that you mentioned there. I mean, Julie, one of the things that's often come up to me in discussions around this is okay for new buildings, but what do we do about old buildings? And in terms of measuring the carbon footprint, I mean, do you take a view on embedding carbon versus new build? I mean, it's just interesting to see how how business can potentially, if they want to drive change, how they can work their way through what seems, at least from an outside view, from my view, to be quite a complex set of kind of guidelines.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's a really good question, and absolutely why when we came up with our framework definitions for net zero carbon, the whole life net zero carbon definition is the single best definition that one should adopt. Unfortunately, to Colin's point earlier, we don't yet have access to all of the data that we need to make some of those whole life carbon assessment decisions at the right moment in time. But if you think about old buildings, people often say the most sustainable building is the one that was never built. Because if you can reuse and adapt and refurbish an existing building time and time again, it has stood that test of time, and its inherent embedded carbon is far, far lower than that which is torn down after 20, 30 years and start again, right? So, and we're not even good at recycling the materials of that one yet. So we have a very long way to go to get that right. I think with existing buildings, probably the single biggest challenge is the decarbonisation of heat. Definitely for us here in the UK, that is going to be the big challenge, both for new and existing. But in a sense, with new, you can start to sort of install different types of heat that are off gas grids or that are not fossil fuel based, but for existing and particularly old historic buildings, some of that is really challenging. And for new buildings, that embodied carbon that is associated with the manufacturing and production process of the materials, the transportation of those materials to site, the wastage of some of those materials is massive, and it's much more challenging for us to tackle that aspect of it. There are some emerging glimmers of hope, and of course, if we are to achieve net zero carbon by 2050, all industry sectors will have to decarbonise, including those very energy intensive and costly ones like steel and cement and concrete and so on. But one can't get away from both of those challenges in trying to achieve that zero carbon goal. So I would say, as early as possible in the kind of design process, almost at concept design, before you've even gone to planning, you need to be trying to do that whole life carbon assessment piece and trying to work out, what will be the carbon sort of profile of the whole asset over its entire lifetime, and how do you drive out the carbon of each of those stages of the life cycle, which we're not yet that good at.
No, okay, interesting. I mean, I just want to pick up with you, Clemens. I mean, we've seen there that it seems as though, it kind of needs everybody in the whole value chain to be committed to this goal as well, which means not only the company doing the measuring, but also then you've got government aligned to this. You've also got agencies aligned to this. You've got tenants aligned to this. I mean, is that already the case, do you feel, in terms of the relationships you've got, I suppose, with tenants and those kinds of things? Or is this an ongoing work that needs to be done, really?
I think we're already well onto that journey. Is it 100% supported by everybody in the chain? Not quite. But I think most parties recognise now that we are in a situation where our planet is definitely being influenced by our own behaviour as humans, and we need to therefore act, and we need to change the way that we do things. And I can only say that we're very fortunate that we have our investor clients who really believe in the importance of this topic too. We are challenged to really want to be a force for good in what we're doing. We want to really deliberately future-proof our assets whilst under our stewardship. And part of that journey is bringing everyone along in the value chain that we can. And with some tenants, that's easier than with others. With some municipal councils, that's easier than with others. But we have to keep trying, and that requires discipline and an optimism. And you keep. I think reverting back to what Julie was saying earlier, the link to value is potentially not yet as obvious as we would like it to be. But in the context of increasing regulations, the EU Green Deal, all of the disclosure regulations that are coming up in the coming years, the more you can demonstrate that your assets are ahead of the curve, that they're meeting those minimum norms, that they're contributing to climate change mitigation or adaptation, then from an investment perspective, you're less likely to get a discount on the value of your assets. And I think that's ultimately what is a key consideration for us. And demonstrating that also for the occupiers of our buildings, that this is going to be a benefit to them. I think if you've got lower operating costs, which we can demonstrate already by having more efficient buildings, they may get the benefit of that in their operating cost, but that means that they can also rent at that location for longer. And that, again, is a value for a landlord. And I think those kinds of interpretations will start to become much more the norm in the valuation of real estate too.
And just to drill down quickly, I mean, we're pretty short on time now, but I just wanted to drill down quickly into the discussion that I had briefly with Colin earlier, which is about, whether there's pushback on data sharing and those kinds of things. Is that something where then you actively incentivize, I suppose, occupiers, tenants to share that data, Clemens?
Yeah, so over the years, we've been obviously trying to collect data for a long time, doing it manually. We've had various success over the years. We're at around, I don't know, sometimes 50, 60%. We've managed to get up to 80% 1 year. I think trying to do this now in a more automated fashion with the help of a proper system will help us on that journey. In the end, I think sharing energy data is not necessarily the highest priority for our retail tenants. Let's be fair. However, we still want to just keep having the conversation, keep explaining why we would like this information, why we think it is beneficial also to them. And I think in these times when our retailers are struggling and they are asking things of us, we can quite easily ask for things back that don't have to actually cost them anything. So there's a bit of a carrot and stick in that process, quid pro quo. I think that's part of the discussion that we have in the relationship with our tenants. But it is a key part of getting that insight to be able to make the right kind of analysis and the right kind of judgment call on what actions you need to take with which priority, and whether that's a landlord action or a tenant action, or whether it's something that we can do together.
Okay, good. And this is a sort of general question for anybody really. Just to kind of wrap up in a way, is what do you think are the key, and I'll start with you, Julie, if I can. What are the key practical steps that a company needs to make if it wants to start moving towards zero carbon, let's say by 2050 anyway? So what are the practical steps? What should they be doing now?
Measuring their footprint. To Colin and Clemens's point, they need to know where their emissions are coming from in terms of the activities that they undertake. And in doing that, not just measuring their own direct activities and their occupation of space or their use of energy on a construction site or in landlord areas, but actually their the emissions up and down their supply chain. So their customers, their suppliers, and so on. So measuring and then driving that down wherever possible through the use of efficiency measures, through the use of renewables as much as possible, and then offsetting as much of that as that which is left that they can. Those are really the basic steps.
Okay, that's great. And last question, which is, so if a real estate investor wants to join Clemens and Redevco on this journey, on the drive to zero carbon, who should they talk to? Should they talk to you, Clemens, you, Colin, you, Julie, or all of you?
As far as I'm concerned, at least, we're happy to talk to anybody. We're happy to share, our insights, our journey, the things that we're trying to do. We don't have answers to everything by all means, but I think we have an ambition. We know where we want to get to, and we're going to keep plugging away at finding solutions to doing that. And we need as much help as the next investor or asset manager. So collaboration, again, as far as I'm concerned, transparency on best cases, best practices would be really useful. So look forward to continuing the dialogue.
Great. Thanks very much. Thank you to all of you for a really interesting discussion. I've learnt a lot from it. I hope it's been useful for everybody who's watching. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Clemens. Really interesting to see how this progresses. And certainly I'm interested in picking up on this again and doing another event around this and just tracking to see where the changes have gone, because from my sense, this seems to be moving much faster now than the discussions we've been having around this, over the past few years. So thanks again for joining us.